Welcome to Provisional Aspirations, a podcast exploring the intersection of psychology, philosophy, and clinical mental health. I'm Thomas W. Moore, religious trauma survivor and doctoral student in counselor education and supervision. Join me as I indulge my academic interest in the human spiritual experience, a curiosity that I couldn't fully explore as a member of a high-demand religious group. But now I'm learning out loud, and it feels great. The art of psychotherapy has changed over the years. Scientific progress has led to a greater understanding of the brain and the body, and how the brain and the body contribute to the mind that at times can get distressed and cause us to reach out to someone else in the healing arts. But societal change also causes a shift in the values of psychotherapy. Much of the interpersonal distress that we experience as humans has to do with our individuality, our individual, personal, subjective psychological landscape rubbing up against the societal landscape and the dynamics of social and interpersonal power that we experience on the day-to-day. When we don't have the tools to navigate this, we end up in stress, depression, anxiety, and this can lead to even the worst kinds of psychiatric distress. As the mores of society, the values of the public change intergenerationally and with progress in technology and other things, then the types of friction that we experience when our individual self rubs up against the social world will change, meaning that the values of psychotherapy, the mechanisms of psychotherapy will change based on the needs of the public. One major criticism of psychology, academic and clinical psychology, has been that the evidence base historically favored privileged communities. Upper middle class and college-age students were tested to come up with the major theories that have been accepted into society about the way that the brain and the mind works. And while the mental health awareness movement of the past 10 to 15 years has done a lot to bring legitimacy to the suffering of many individuals, a paradoxical situation has occurred wherein the clinical mechanism, with its diagnoses of psychological disorders, has become the hegemonic ideology. The way that we describe human suffering, such that an individual may feel the need to leverage a diagnosis to be understood, allowed place for in their society. This goes very much against old school ways of thinking that attempted to develop more mature social functioning, cognitive functioning, so that an individual could move away from a diagnosis with the aspiration of health, with the aspiration of wellness. Modern neuroscience is clear. The brain can change. It's a plastic organ. And psychotherapy can change the material and function of the brain. So while diagnosis is essential for the clinical mechanism and important, obviously, to get funding and consideration for extreme cases of mental unwellness, the common acceptance of diagnostic nomenclature in the everyday public can be a roadblock to an individual who would like to rid themselves of a diagnosis, would like to make the changes necessary to no longer meet the diagnostic criteria for a certain mental health condition. This was not an uncommon way of thinking in the past, but now appears to be somehow counterculture. While certain mental health disorders are, they can also not be. That while there are markers of mental health conditions in the brain, that the brain can change and symptoms can remit. The so-called cognitive therapies that emerged from the 1950s through to their most popular cognitive behavioral therapy in the 1980s mechanized the art of psychotherapy such that it could be run through the scientific method. There's therefore copious evidence for the efficacy of cognitive behavioral therapy and the topic of this podcast, Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, a modality developed by Albert Ellis in the 1950s, he claims before Aaron Beck created his, showing that these therapies worked in their time for their demographic. My concern is this: if therapeutic ways of thinking that were beneficial in relieving the conflict between the individual and the societal forces of their time become the societal forces of our time, then what methods do we use in the therapy room to counteract these? This is topic for further consideration, further podcasts, and the direction of my thinking and research. But for this episode, I want to introduce you a little bit more thoroughly to Rational Emotional Behavioral Therapy from Albert Ellis. And in this article, which I'll read to you, I also discuss a little bit about some of the criticisms that could be leveled against the modality, and then counter those criticisms with some questions again about how REBT's demand for self-confrontation, its demand for responsibility for one's own emotional situation, cognitive situation, can challenge some of the obsequiousness that many have seen in the public towards psychiatric infrastructure. Here we go. I'm calling this Stop Whining and Make Yourself Happy. Albert Ellis's controversial Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy. Albert Ellis was a prolific writer, with 68 books published for the public reader listed on his Wikipedia page. Ellis's 1999 self-help book, How to Make Yourself Happy and Remarkably Less Disturbable, which is the basis of this podcast, joins the parade with titles like Homosexuality, Its Causes and Cures, The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Manhunting, Sex and the Liberated Man, and How to Live with a Neurotic. You can just get a sense for how inflammatory these titles would be in 2024. Ellis prepared the book How to Make Yourself Happy to provide a high-level overview of his REBT modality, which he adamantly asserts, as I've mentioned, was created before the now much more popular CBT developed by Aaron Beck. The book provides a summary of the origins of the modality, Ellis's ABC approach to altering limiting thoughts and behaviors, and practical suggestions and case studies demonstrating the efficacy of the modality. Ellis's old-world, pull-yourself-up-by-your-bootstraps approach to self-actualization comprises the totality of modern multiculturalist therapy's criticism of theoretical psychology. But in the post-mental health awareness movement era, is REBT's focus on placing responsibility for wellness on the client just what we need? Ellis begins by providing the origin story of REBT, telling the story of himself as a young man searching for the key to happiness in the philosophical writings and religions of the world. He read the Greek philosophers, the Stoics, and Eastern thinkers from Buddhism and Taoism, modern thinkers from the existential humanist movement, such as Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, are called out in Ellis' work. And he also nods to Fritz Perls, acknowledging how Perls' approach, called Gestalt therapy, embodies the non-dualist perspectives that he also introduces in REBT. The book, How to Make Yourself Happy, gives the impression that Ellis is widely read and has formed a comprehensive generalist perspective of human psychology, one that he has reduced to an easily accessible and implementable set of guidelines for moderating distressing emotions and behaviors. Ellis reduces mental wellness to a simple mnemonic: A, B, C. He breaks this down. A stands for an activating event or adversity. B refers to a belief that, in contrast with the activating event, actually causes mental distress. And C, consequences. These are consequences in the form of intense emotion or maladaptive behavior that arise because of a faulty belief. Ellis makes this distinction clear. Adverse circumstances and life events do not cause long-term depression or anxiety. Rather, it is self-defeating beliefs and cognitions that lead to mental unwellness. Therefore, Ellis says it's the client's responsibility to interrupt and reframe the beliefs about life's changes to make themselves happy. For example, if a client wants to succeed in a romantic relationship and fails, this is an activating event. This activating event could be followed by a destructive belief, such as, I have to find a partner. I can't be happy without one. I'm not desirable. I'm not good with women or men. I can't just keep trying and failing, etc. The result of this kind of inelegant language in the mind, if left unchecked, is psychological suffering. This is the consequence. And this could be in the form of depression, anxiety, or repeated failure based on shame and insecurity. An individual could withdraw from opportunities to find a partner, or limit their enjoyment as a single person. Ellis acknowledges that emotional responses to adverse events are healthy and normal. We're disappointed when we fail, but that they do not lead to clinically significant psychiatric disorders. The latter are caused by the maladaptive beliefs that occur in response to adverse events. Thus, Ellis places the responsibility for wellness squarely in the lap of the sufferer, by asking them to use more philosophically sophisticated internal language. Fundamental to Ellis' perspective is Eastern philosophy's illusion of the self. The self-concept can become rigid, making interaction with the world frictive. In the attempt to know ourselves, we humans often create concrete storylines about our intrinsic nature, cognitive delusions that we cling to, despite the evidence drawn from interaction with our interpersonal environment. This can lead to framing distressing life events as negative interpretations of our fundamental character, personality, or self, and this results in depression and anxiety. Ellis even warns that thinking of oneself as a good person is an irrational cognition that will undoubtedly meet with contrary evidence in our daily activities. If you think you're good, you can also think that you're bad. This is a black and white perspective that can lead to socially dangerous arrogance on the one hand, or shame on the other. Ellis cites the American psychologist George Kelly, who demonstrated that human cognition tends toward dichotomous categorizations of the world. However, our entropic world cannot be categorized, despite our best attempts, even those of the scientific method, as they attempt to formalize and quantify a chaotic and disordered system. Similarly, linguistic cognition fails to adequately communicate the complexities of life. In the reciprocal language-thought reflex, unsophisticated language yields dichotomous thought, which in turn leads to frustration when we attempt to fit our daily experiences or our psychological experiences into static worldviews and the internal narratives that accompany them. Acknowledging this human tendency, Ellis recommends using elegant and moderate language in our internal monologues, avoiding absolutist language like can't, always, never, and must, the overuse of which Ellis humorously refers to as masturbation. You can see the Taoist influence in Ellis' work here. A lot of Taoist meditation, for example, is to identify binaries in the mind, categories in the mind, and then to deconstruct them in consciousness. Ellis is very careful with his language to avoid creating these sorts of binaries in the mind, and also to acknowledge paradox. Here's an example of Ellis's suggested language for his reader to avoid extremism in ideology or religion. He suggests this: I shall try to avoid extremism, to refuse to see things as all good or all bad. I shall try to avoid extreme optimism or extreme pessimism. A more balanced, more realistic approach will be my usual goal. But even that goal, I shall not take to extremes. You can see how the language, usual, try, sometimes, all of this is to impress upon the reader the flexibility of the mind. If we use this kind of nuanced language, we soon come to realize, really believe, that many of the lines that we draw in the sand are rubbable outable. And this forces the mind to constantly work, constantly reframe and moderate perceptions of the world. This is the kind of work, both psychologically speaking and from the perspective of the brain, that leads to health. Ellis does not indulge in the empathy of traumatological perspectives that are common today, that emphasize how dynamics of power and influence upon disempowered individuals can contribute to depression. As a result, I believe that, if not used carefully, REBT could fail to create an atmosphere of safety for individuals who suffer from the symptoms of, for example, post-traumatic stress from interpersonal trauma. Notice this rather jarring passage that, if tweeted in 2024, would certainly get Ellis canceled. He says, and I quote, "Actually, nothing can be 100% bad, because it invariably could be worse. If you're raped and killed, that is bad, but not 100% bad, because several of your loved ones could also be raped and slaughtered, and that would be worse." End quote. Ellis, there's a victim of childhood sexual abuse in the room, and they do not feel safe right now. But is Ellis onto something? When do modern traumatological perspectives reach the point of diminishing returns? Must not all trauma, after being given life and breath in the safety of the therapeutic chamber, return to sleep again in the client's transcendent acceptance? For traumatized clients, perhaps an introductory phase of psychodynamic or traumatological treatment could be used first to heal neurological wounds before implementing this in-your-face confrontational technique that is suggested by REBT. Returning to the issue of relying on diagnoses, not just in clinical settings, but also in social and professional settings, notice what Ellis says on page 64 of his book, and I quote, "Be careful with labeling yourself with some aspects of your disturbances. You have perhaps depressed feelings at certain times and under certain conditions. But if you therefore conclude, I am depressive, you encourage yourself to practically always feel depressed, under many conditions. This is one of the dangers of our medical tradition, that we often label people as depressives and thereby discourage them from trying to change. Thank you, Ellis. Well put. The mental health awareness movement appears to have forgotten that the brain is plastic and that mental health diagnoses are not brain diagnoses. Effective psychotherapy changes the structure and function of the brain. Mental health assessment measures that are used in therapy rooms and psychiatry offices are confounded by the client's self-report error and the limits of the practitioner's clinical objectivity. Modern psychiatry and psychotherapy have to embrace neuroscientific instruments and maybe even develop better instruments for testing brain activity, so that these brain tests can be functioned at regular intervals and test for the biological and neurochemical markers of a disorder. Tools like this hold the potential to harden up psychotherapy, to make it not just about testing the efficacy of a treatment based on how a client says they feel or how they're functioning in their everyday life, but to also see how the brain is reacting on a regular basis to psychotherapeutic treatment. This would avoid the issue of clients absorbing a diagnosis into their self-concept, such that it becomes an obstacle to both brain and behavior change. Another topic along these lines has to do with what people call neurodivergence nowadays. Of course, Ellis does not mention this in his book, but I'll extrapolate his ideas to the current situation. Most who leverage this label in their social environment do not have material evidence of a non-normative neurological condition in the brain. Individuals who identify as neurodivergent ought not to be compelled by society to lean upon a clinical diagnosis. Paradoxically, those who refuse to do so may find that their ongoing struggle for understanding of both self and social group facilitates psychological and neurological complexification and moves them towards an individuated and empowered state without the reliance on a pseudoscientific label. Ellis's How to Make Yourself Happy was obviously written to a mostly upper-middle-class American audience, with common mid- to late 20th century challenges resulting from the movement of society away from the norms of the earlier part of the century. Despite Ellis being out of touch with current multiculturalist ethic, his insights on the interface of individual psychology and societal forces remain sound. If a practitioner takes the time first to understand the values, cultural assumptions, motivations, and frustrated goals of a client of any culture, they can use REBT to determine where the client's beliefs contribute to their mental suffering. This is especially important given REBT's confrontational style. If a non-majority client enters a therapy room with existing prejudices against clinical authority, the infrastructural power of the counselor, or their gender or race, the counselor has to first build adequate rapport before performing directive REBT therapy. For example, How to Make Yourself Happy is outspoken about the limitations of religion and politics and their impact on individual mental health. The modern multiculturalist therapist must be more sensitive to the explosivity of such topics in our era, and the checkered reputation the Western academic and scientific psychology has earned over the years. Ellis wrote in a fixed world and encouraged his readers not to set their sights on large-scale social change, but to be flexible in their interpretation of their situation. Ellis's writing greatly contrasts popular appeals to narcissism, that is, the public broadcast of a categorical self-identity, which is fomented by social media. As a result, I believe that Ellis's stingy empathy and confrontational you-can-do-it style would not be palatable to a modern progressive reader. That being said, after smirking at both the cover art of this 1999 release and Ellis's glaringly outdated rhetorical style, I found myself subtly invigorated by my reading of the book How to Make Yourself Happy. Reading Ellis was like receiving a lecture from an exuberant grandfather. Ellis passionately desires to bring hope to his readers and clients. And according to Ellis, and the evidence base, REBT works for most people, most of the time. I've already noticed some of my own irrational beliefs over the past few days, and found myself thinking, what would Albert Ellis say? It has been mostly helpful, most of the time. I've even caught myself repeating the refrain of an ironic song that Ellis said he used to perform on his guitar at his group therapy sessions. It goes like this. I cannot have my wishes fulfilled. Whine, whine, whine. I cannot have every frustration stilled. Whine, whine, whine. Life really owes me the things that I miss. Fate has to grant me eternal bliss. And since I must settle for less than this, whine, whine, whine. It's very easy to find Albert Ellis offensive. I'll leave you with some audio from a YouTube video that gives you a sense of his serpentine charm. Albert Ellis was happy, and he's laughing at us for not figuring out how to be. And after shaking your fist at him for his blind arrogance and gloating privilege, one cannot help but to grow.
I went to the lake at Bronx Botanical Gardens again at midnight, walked around it for an hour, and said, now why am I so afraid of rejection? What will happen to me? Nobody's going to cut my balls off, so I'll get by. Even without balls, I'll get by. So I said, because I need them, or think I need them. And I said, that's crap. I do not need what I want. I want it, but I do not need it. It's not necessary, not absolute. And I decided to give that up. I gave up need. So now I like many things, including women, including sex, including music, including philosophy, including therapy, but I don't need to do them, and I'm sorry and disappointed healthfully when I don't do them, but I don't put myself down or put others down or put the world down, and I'm a happy human despite all my physical ills.